On Wednesday afternoon, June 22, 1921, George T. Drake and his wife Nellie marked the occasion of their silver wedding anniversary by posing for informal photographs in the rear of their home at 138 East Oakland Avenue in the north end of Columbus, Ohio. At the time, East Oakland Avenue was an upscale address bounded on the one side by Clintonville and on the other by the enlarging acreage of the Ohio State University campus. They were married in 1896 in Corning, Ohio, a once bustling railroad center in Perry County where he had been active in local and, for a time, statewide politics as a spokesman for the Republican Party. He is 49, and in this photograph is bordered by neighbor Alec McMullen, standing at left, a fellow Perry County native who had emigrated to Columbus and whose two sons, Ward and Arthur, were friends of the Drake sons, and on the right, John Fotinger, an older neighbor in their same block. Mrs. Drake, the former Elizabeth Ellen Goulding, was born in 1876 in Chapel Hill, a small Catholic settlement on a hillside overlooking Corning, Ohio. She is 45 in this photograph and had mothered 6 children by the time it was taken. 3 of the children were still living at home. In a photograph taken that same day, Paul Drake, born in 1912, is shown in the foreground wearing a striped shirt. The toddler next to him is William Tornes, son of one of the other neighbors. And standing, second from the left, is James Watts Drake, Jim, born in 1907. He is 13 years old. A third son, still at home, was his father's namesake, 20-year-old George T. Drake, Jr. 4 years later, in 1925, he would take the family car, an air-cooled Franklin sedan, to the Miami area in the hopes of cashing in on the Florida real estate boom of that period. The eldest son, William Francis Drake, was already practicing medicine. This is his medical school graduation portrait. Though only in his mid-20s, his baldness, a family trait, made him look older than he actually was. In person, he had a magnetic charm. Adeline Drake, their only girl, was her father's favorite, as his inscription on this photograph shows. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the Ohio State University and would shortly become the fiancée of a young Columbus-born graduate of the Naval Academy, Austin Magley. This obituary tells of the child who didn't survive. After an illness of but 24 hours, Dudley Hampton, the 16-month-old son of Mr. and Mrs. George T. Drake, died at their home on High Street Wednesday night at 11:55 o'clock of pneumonia. The baby had been named for a respected attorney and politician, Dudley Hampton Foster, who was George T. Drake's closest friend from adolescence onward. The baby's father, scarcely consolable, wrote the dates of the baby's death and burial in longhand when he placed the obituary in the family scrapbook. All that survives of the infant Dudley Hampton Drake is this photograph taken on his first birthday in New Lexington, Ohio, where they were then living. A heart defect was diagnosed, but the state of medicine at the time precluded saving the child. He died in his mother's arms as she was rocking him to sleep. Perhaps on that summer day in 1921, George and Nellie Drake took time to think back to setting up housekeeping in Corning, Ohio in the summer of 1896. This photograph shows their household quite as it was in 1899, 3 years into their marriage and having already parented 2 children. His photograph, as valedictorian of his high school class, is displayed in the frame in the upper left portion of the picture. Seated in front of the lace curtains dear to her Irish heart is the young bride, Nellie Goulding Drake. Her dress is stylish, a blouse with a bold striped print, and her hair is brushed back in the fashion of the time. She is holding daughter Adeline, then just a year old. Her 28-year-old husband, dressed in light-colored trousers, a dark coat, ankle-length buttoned shoes, and a high starched collar, is holding their firstborn, William Francis, then just 2 years old. By 1899, George Drake was serving the second year of his first term as postmaster of Corning, Ohio, having been appointed in the spring of 1897 by President William McKinley. A signed portrait of the Ohio-born president adorned one of the other walls in the Drake living room. A mere 2 years later, McKinley would be assassinated while visiting the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley had been put into the presidency by the same political machinery that in a smaller way was already benefiting George T. Drake's budding career. George and Nellie Drake's home overlooked Corning's Main Street, shown here in an 1898 photograph celebrating Dewey Day, marking the Admiral's victory in Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. The print shows Corning quite as it was at the time, a smallish city of dirt streets, plank sidewalks, and horse-drawn carriages, there being no automobiles as yet. In the parade, one of the young soldiers being honored was a nephew of George T. Drake, actually a young man not far from his own age. This is Leo Drake, in uniform, safely back from the war. Family lore has it that George and Nellie Drake met at the Congo School, a rural schoolhouse in the Corning district. The school had 4 classrooms and 4 teachers. In this photograph, the senior teacher, Asa Smith by name, is shown with his class in the 1894-95 school year. That same year, George T. Drake was completing his first year as a school teacher and is shown in this photograph with his class. He is standing in the uppermost row at the right. Note the presence, incidentally, of at least 3 black children, showing that the public schools, even in rural Ohio, were already integrated in the North. This badly faded photograph verifies that the next year, 1895-96, a new teacher was added to the roster, Nellie E. Goulding, the first woman teacher in the Congo School's 30-year history. What's more telling, though, is the notation that appears on the other end of this group photograph. In his hand it says simply, George T. Drake, who taught in an adjoining room, just in this picture as her fellow. We know that together in the summer of 1895, the 2 of them attended the Perry County Teachers Institute. They and the district's other teachers were photographed on the steps of the courthouse in New Lexington, Ohio, the county seat. George Drake is on the lower right. A line shows his place. Nellie Goulding is shown by a faint line on the lower left. We see her looking in the direction of her new beau rather than at the camera. The Congo School was indeed the site of their courtship, but George Drake and Nellie Goulding spent the better part of their teenage years together in this building, which George Drake Jr. and I photographed in Corning in September of 1963, just before the building was razed. Originally, the lower right portion was a grocery store, and the store's proprietor was Francis W. Drake, the father of George Drake. He leased the storefront from the family which owned the building and lived in its upper story, the family of William and Margaret Goulding, Nellie Goulding's parents. This surviving photograph from 1889 shows the building as it was, and in the foreground shows the Drakes and the Gouldings interacting. Notice that except for the storefront, the building hardly looks appreciably different from what it did 70 years later. The photograph suggests that it's a summer morning that day in 1889. All the windows are open, there were no such things as screens as yet, and the awning is up, suggesting that the sun was at its morning elevation. Looking closer, we see a neighbor, Bob Underwood, standing at the far right next to Francis W. Drake, who has pulled back the brim of his straw hat and is dressed in shirt sleeves and vest, posed with his hands on his hips. His teenage son George is wearing a derby hat on the left near the doorway. On the other side of the photograph, the youngest of the 4 Goulding girls, Bertille, or Bertie as she was called, is in the black polka-dot dress and is posed with other neighborhood children.